Hello, everybody. This is Jason Jeffries. I'm here for the Alliance Project, aka the Rebel Alliance. Doing some stuff for the Leak Project. A couple other programs out there. I know Matthew LaCroix and Joe Croy, Jay. They have a channel. I've been kind of collaborating with them, and Dave Dobbs and all those, trying to bring unique minds and different aspects of knowledge and just basically wisdom to the table, so you can kind of get a new view from the plethora we bring, and the new minds and the links and connections we made might open new viewpoints. I know it definitely has for me and for other people I've talked to as well. So tonight's show is going to be about Earth and how we're quarantined here, basically, in theory. And if you look back through history, we're going to touch on basically there's been at least about 30,000 documents through the course of history that talk about advanced beings that either came to Earth, visited Earth, or were here before us. So that's the topic of tonight's show, and I hope you guys enjoy. Now, if we start with the Bible and the familiar term, the Nephilim, most people think that that translate roughly to those who came down, but there's other interpretations that actually mean those who were cast down. There's an Indian tale where it talks of Shiva and how there's 3 demon races that came to attack the earth, and Shiva had a weapon against them that fired upon their airships and destroyed them, essentially. So we got the Vedas, the Mahabharata, and the Bible, that anytime it talks about this, the Nephilim or any of that, it was basically edited out or removed. So anytime they got to it, they just left it out. They didn't even bother translating. There's many references in the Bible, people flying in clouds and mysteries that are beyond comprehension that they remove, as well as they leave in. Now, if you remove any of what you've learned from maybe Zechariah Sitchin and his translations going back, they say 400,000 years, things like that, you got to remember there's many visitations, many races, and many things going on. So if you really focus on some of the more unheard of ones, like the Celtic ones, they say that we were visited about 50,000 years ago. But the tales go that a race of beings that were expelled from their own star system, kind of kicked out, were being chased, essentially. Some say Sirius, some say the Pleiades. That's under speculation, and I guess neither here nor there at this point. They're being chased by their, I guess you could call them their pursuers or their home race. You know, you got to consider we're about 1,000 or 2,000 years ahead of advance where we are now technologically wise, and they were going through an Armageddon situation on their planet. So they were being chased out, and this is where some scholars tend to differ, but a lot of people think this is where, like, the big fear from women, and the ancient fear of women, and basically this hierarchy of women, kind of where they always downplayed the woman, or didn't, even in the Bible, Eve and this and that. We'll get into that later, but it was because they were, I guess, a female dominant society, that these females were supposedly super psychic, but they didn't have any empathy or compassion, anything that us humans feel. They never experienced that. They were so much evolved past those points that they were almost cold and machine-like. So these women they were pursuing these people, which were the men of their race. And you could say that was Enlil and Enki when they were leaving the cloning fields, however you want to say it, escaping their planet. They're being pursued by these women, and the way I understand it is either you want to look at it as the women or just their home species, they were the rogues, whatever, but they were running from them, and they pretended they did what my understanding is they did a false landing on Tiamat, which is now the asteroid belt Ceres, and some folks say which is the Earth, but the Earth actually existed at that point. So I have a hard time kind of really conceiving that. But Tiamat, so they did a false landing, which we say in a lot of many ancient cultures said they could actually see Tiamat in the sky, and it had many waters and this and that. But so when they landed on there, Marduk, if you look at the Enuma Elish, it says he actually was given the power to destroy it. But so the pursuers land here, or the renegades land on Tiamat. They do a false landing there. They really landed on Earth. When their pursuers detect that, they destroy Tiamat and put a barrier around the Earth. That's how I understand it. Also wanted to mention that when they were creating this barrier, that after they destroyed Tiamat, that the moon was actually supposed to be a lock of this barrier. It has a lot to do with it. So if you look back at the cultures, they completely did not have the moon before this. If you talk about Tiamat, Phaeton, all this and that, the moon wasn't before that. It came after. So I believe they put it there for a lock of this boundary. So it's why it's always facing us. You know, on the dark side of the moon, I'm sure there's something that helps contain us here in this quarantine. It had almost. They had the gold and the sustainability. They could go back a hero because of their Armageddon scenario on their planet, where they had the supernova that knocked their planet out of orbit and sent it hurtling through the star system, and they needed to essentially get gold to make an atmosphere so they could sustain this highly elliptical orbit that comes really close to the sun and stays right out here. That way, when it's out in the deeper spots, it can live off of volcanic eruptions and the core temperature, things like that, reflecting the heat, sustaining like a greenhouse effect. And when it came close to the sun, it would have essentially just the same thing as an atmosphere, like an astronaut's mask, to protect them. So when it's reflecting back the toxic and harmful rays, so they wouldn't die or age rapidly. Now, when they were here, supposedly they had to leave again eventually because the stage of our star, the sun, was going through a point where their women wasn't ovulating, and they'd say, "Hey, I'll be back." Arnold Schwarzenegger, essentially. But that's one part of it. So whether you want to take it as the pursuers landed on Tiamat, the renegades, the rebels, destroyed them, and then essentially overthrew their government and came back the victor, because whatever happens in the West stays in the West, essentially. Or you could take it as these pursuers chased them here and destroyed them. I completely think that's wrong. The fallen angels, they were dispelled. They did their own thing. They'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven, type, so to speak. So that's my understanding. So, as I said, brief summary. My belief. This is my belief, not other people's theory exactly. Because, like I said, the theory differs. I think they were being chased, and they got their women followers, their pursuers. They were ahead of them, essentially. So they landed on Earth. They staged the landing on Tiamat, gave it the go-ahead, destroyed these pursuers, and blam, there. Problem solved for them. I just want to add, throughout history, that other civilizations called Tiamat Lucifer and Luna, not the same as our moon, but just want to put that out there as well. They called it that because it looked like a second sun. The Greeks called it Phaeton. It had all these oceans and such a luminescent atmosphere that it looked like a second sun in the sky. And the way I understand it is they even set up like a dummy base on Tiamat that actually sent out these, electromagnetic pulses almost to give hint that they were there. So there's more clues that say that they landed on Earth, they were ahead of their pursuers, false landed, destroyed their pursuers, and then took over. That's where that whole theory comes from. That's where I wanted to kind of clear up anything. That's why I was saying my theory is both these people are, essentially all these people are right. the pursuers came, the renegades, the males were ahead, these females, and they landed on Earth, set up a false space on Tiamat. But in my theory, and really, is these people weren't dumb enough to just land. When they sensed them there, they destroyed Tiamat. Okay? They destroyed Tiamat. And then, as a precautionary measure, just in case, they quarantined the Earth. They put an ethereal field around us, the Van Allen radiation belt, something that completely contains this. So you can look into the Emerald Tablets, and Thoth actually talks about it. It tells you not to go past the boundaries because the hounds will get you. If you look in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, with Anubis and all that, they will get you if you go past a certain point. They're talking about your OOBs, your out-of-body experiences. If you travel so far in astral projection that you go past a certain point, that they can detect you. And if you get scared and go back into your body, they can literally follow you back into your body. And the Emerald Tablets, he tells us to go in circles because they can only travel linear. So if you go directly into your body, they can follow you directly into your body and essentially trap your soul forever is what they're saying. Do not do it. Thoth even warned about it. So, but it's not something to be like scared about, because as you begin having out-of-body experiences, you're going to be like doing it in your bedroom or neighborhoods that you already know and places that you can visit. It's not really something to be afraid about. But if you really look into it, even in the Bible, they talk about the fallen ones and the firmament and all that. Yeah, I think if you really think about it, they didn't land. They false land when they sensed that they were there, and they thought the pursuers thought they were there. They destroyed Tiamat, quarantined Earth. So blam, they could go back instead of essentially kind of having people saying destroy them as they land on Tiamat. That doesn't make as much sense to me, because then the rest of the story, it wouldn't make sense. That's why I say they had it halfway right, but they didn't land. The pursuers actually destroyed the false base and quarantined the real one. So we'll go on from there. And this would also explain a lot of the, maybe the deluge, the flood epidemic, where, great amounts of water or fish falling from the sky alive and things like that people can't explain. It's essentially because, if something dies out there, it's like the conditions of flash freezing. Basically, it's in stasis. So as it comes into the ionosphere, it will get life from our Earth again, pick back up, and just blam. Fish would be falling out alive out of the sky. It's crazy. It's really neat to think about. So after they thought their pursuers were gone and they thought it was safe, they came up out of tunnels and from the oceans, and they set up shop on the top of Appalachia continent off the east. And they basically take right in the center of the Atlantic Ocean, all the way down from Florida up to Greenland, Iceland. It was a huge, massive continent. If you look back at my other videos, I discussed this more. But that's where they set up their shop, their island, and essentially started to rebuild, from there. Once they got their technology advanced enough, they started to, become more evolved than we could even imagine, essentially. They were way advanced beings, but they actually went through some genetic playing, manipulation, and they created some races. They made the original race, the Homo Atlanteans, and they left. They realized, like, wait, I don't want to serve anymore. I'm awesome, because these creatures, these beings made them in their image, but tried to make them perfect. They took out perfections, and these things realized, hey, I don't need you, and they took over the Earth. Essentially, they just moved out to all places of the Earth, and that's what we call the sons of the serpent. That's what I would call, like, the sons of the serpent, not the brotherhood of the serpent, because they were the sons of it. So the next race they created essentially was Adam and Eve. That was the Adam and the Eve. So they had the Adams, a bunch of males, and the Eves, a bunch of females. And they let them go in the Garden of Eden, Atlantis, essentially, which is where the original story goes from. So they wanted their slaves, so they made new slaves. They gave them a cap, so they gave them like a level cap where, hey, you can't get past this point, and basically made them ignorant. When the sons of the serpent seen this, they came and tried to say, "Hey guys, let's go. Don't you know you're gods?" Basically, and when they're doing that, the women took to the idea. The men were just this masculine energy. They were thinking linear, and they didn't want to take that. But the females were understanding. They connected. So essentially, they took all the females, and they couldn't procreate at this time. The Adams and the Eves couldn't, have sex and have a baby. So essentially, at the time, they took all the females, and then the females took all the men with them, which if they wouldn't have done, I think our genetics probably wouldn't have been, it would have been more pure. We'd probably have more of this Atlantis DNA in ours. But when they did that, that's what I think they mean when they say, like, the sons of God meeting with the daughters of man. That's what they meant, because the men weren't buying it, the women were. They were intermingling. They couldn't have babies normally because they were basically, they just couldn't. They didn't have it. So what they did was they had to have, test tube babies, genetic offsprings. So that would be, from that happened again. Then they made, what they did after this was they just completely, when they made the new race, they did, reptilians. They realized when they were doing all this experiments, they found out there's this reptilian race that basically when they were doing the tests on the monkeys, this and that, Enki realized that monkeys had compassion and empathy, and they'd never seen that. They didn't have that when they lived. Him not having that, never seen that, like I said, they were evolved past that point where they just didn't have compassion or empathy or anything like that. He was amazed by it, so he added that into the genetic traits of our people. But they realized when they were experimenting with reptiles that, wow, these things are resilient. They can do anything, and they're cold-blooded. Essentially, you can snatch their babies right in front of them, take their babies away. They'll just stare at you blank, literally cold-blooded too. So they made a race of reptilian offsprings as well. And you go through, and there's a lot of dulling down and kind of, interbreeding and intermingling over the years. But yeah, that's essentially what happened. You can look back to my other videos to kind of pick up where that left off. But when you really look at how they smear this whole, Star Wars is the best example of the truth of any of these stories as you can look at, because you can even go to the interviews, but what inspired him, even the word Jedi. I'm going to actually do a whole show on, the true meaning of the Jedi and the teachings, and, may the Force be with you, and that whole Force Awakening type idea. But essentially it was that Enki, which was Luke, was his father. He was half machine and half, didn't have these compassion, and he was realizing, like, wow, like, he's completely detached, and they ended up, having this battle essentially, and he kind of evolved his outlook on things, if you will. But it actually shows him in a lot better light, instead of showing him as Lucifer, or the devil, or serpent, or all these other things. Because we know, like, if you look at the Egyptian pyramids and everything, essentially they had high knowledge. The Aztecs, all these people, they didn't, the conquistadors destroyed the Aztecs. If you really think about the Mayan civilizations, and that they pop up and blame just destroys and decimates the race. These people weren't messing with the golden rule of not intermingling with other races. They were just doing their thing, kind of basically just secluded from everybody and just teaching high knowledge, elevating human consciousness, even to a point where they're beyond where we are right now. And some of us can still reach that and understand that, but even the alphabet, the Enochian alphabet and the Hebrew alphabet, it's literally talking about plasma waves. The sound and the picture is literally trying to give you something to give your mind to focus on, to angle the plasma wave. And I'll get into this more. It has to do with, you know, the jet tower and your chakras and essentially your spine and the kundalini and all this, but I'll get into that more. It's actually talking about steering plasma and how words and all this, the vibrations, all of it interlinks. That's why these Hebrew and Enochian characters were so important when they actually gave them to us, and that's why I believe that they try to hide that knowledge as well. But that's a whole other show. So I want to note that these sons of the serpent, this original race, who was also known as children of the Elohim, serpent masters, the Jehovah, for when you're talking about the clans in the Bible, the Jehovah clan, and also the Elohim. So many Christians will have kind of a tough time dealing with that, but hey, I'm just trying to, you know, give my understanding of many different boxes, if you will. You know, you can put religions in little boxes and take what's good out of each one and connect it instead of focusing on one. That's you know, when you really take the time and really focus on one, then you don't know, because you don't know. How would you know if you're that one if you haven't read the others? You don't know. You're simply settling for the one you know. And to me, that is blind ignorance. That's not faith. That's different. So if you really take the time to realize that all these things are teaching the same thing, and then you realize, like, you start seeing that these could be different incarnations of the same being coming to teach us, then you realize that, yeah, there's a lot going on here that goes along with religion, coincides with the religion, and there's science to the religion, and the religion backs the science and the history, and it all goes together. And if anything, it makes it all more beautiful and real. It doesn't make it anything you guys need to attack me or others or even your beliefs for, but maybe kind of let go of those dogmatic principles and open up your mind a little. But that's why I always like to say, if you're reading the Bible and it says the word blood or seed, they're talking about genetics. They're not talking about blood, because blood is the second most used word in the Bible beside God. Okay, this is something to think about. So essentially, like, these sons of the serpents, they had the connection to Earth, this human DNA that their fathers and creators didn't have. This sensibility and this not need for destruction and this and that, because, you know, the Borg cube, if you really look into some historical documents and that did exist, there was complete machinations that we'll get into that later if you guys want to, but the whole idea of this is they were in touch with the Earth, so they were wise. They were essentially the Jedi at the time. You know, they were the ones leading the people in humanity and our consciousness. And our slave owners didn't want that. So when you look at the Bible and you look at all the bad name that the serpent or the snake gets, then you can start to understand. But you always realize that it was always linked with knowledge. I mean, even the caduceus, and, you know, it's talking about a braided DNA. The caduceus on so many levels means so many things. I mean, it even is talking about, like, conjugation of, like, fractal waves, if you really think about it, because that is the flame in the mind they're talking about, like a self-sustaining tornado. Because essentially all physics is just a tornado. It's all just about tornadoes. So if you could create a self-sustaining tornado, one that feeds itself, then you can essentially have a self-efficient plasma field, your aura, will be self-sustaining. You would keep your memory after death and essentially be immortal. That's the whole idea of this. That's what the Enlil tablets and these meditations, all these things were teaching. We used to know that until we went through this last pole shift we went through about 13,000 years ago. They completely wiped our hardware and just wiped our software. And I went into that in the previous video if you'd like to look back and hear about that more. But essentially, you know, long story short, after the destruction and the cataclysm that happened about 13,000 years ago that lost Atlantis, they've steadily been trying to build their slaves back up, and the sons of the serpents have been battling against. But once they had essentially get to where their technology was great again, they were trying to explore space travel, things like that. That's why when you think about them traveling out and doing all the stuff they did with the space programs and all the trouble they had out there, and the spaceships being blown up and this and that, landing on, you know, close side of the moon but not going any further, this and that, the Van Allen radiation belt essentially. And when you think about them standing on the moon, I mean, how can you stand on the moon in a spacesuit and with a planet with no atmosphere in the vacuum of space with direct exposure, like 245 degrees and up, like direct exposure right on you? Like, how could you even do that? I don't see how it could be done with the technology they had. But maybe I'm wrong. But I know some of the later Apollo missions were, you know, definitely real, but they weren't really walking around on the moon as much, and they were in the shadow of the moon. They didn't do it during, you know, like a full moon. They did it during a partial, you know. But the idea of it is they you know, John D, you know, the head of the CIA, or not, the MI5, then the Tudor dynasty, essentially, like the original 007 that inspired Ian Fleming's books. He was a master of all these languages, so he figured out, hey, you know, I can talk to everybody else on the planet. I want to talk to these higher beings. So as we see microbes, the organisms that are below us, and if you told people about that a couple hundred years ago, you'd be burned at the stake. They'd be like, oh, there's floating little invisible creatures all around you. It's all over your skin, and, you know, nobody can see it. They think you're crazy. They burn you at the stake. But now that we have the tools to see them, we're not crazy. So the microbes are below us. The macrobes are above us. So he wanted to contact the macrobes. And these macrobes made a deal with him. Hey, you know, we'll help you with this whole quarantine on Earth idea if you give us blood, essentially. And because that would give them a earthly body and they could manifest, you know. Long story short, you guys can look into that whole subject if you'd like to research it more. But the idea of it is it took them about 500 years. That's the whole birth of universities and all these things. This knowledge from the Renaissance is because he contacted this. It was too much for him to do. He had to outsource it. And they needed these people working in groups instead of just working at it. So they made the universities that did this. And that's why until about 80, 90 years ago, normal people couldn't go to universities. It was literally an elite thing, and that was it. So you're basically privileged to even go now. Anyways, the long story short is they found this quarantine. They know there's actually holes in it during certain, you know, I guess you could say Stargate principles, where there's certain alignments, things like that. There's going to be a weak spot where you could travel out, but the timing has to be right and everything, essentially. But think about when they're sending monkeys into space. They were like, you know, they were probably thinking about the DNA lock, like, oh, you know, if we can send out the human, just extract, you know, what the monkey DNA and see if it can go out here. If it can go past where we can, then we know essentially that it's our DNA that's locking us out. It's an ethereal, it's literally a magical type, I wouldn't say magic, but it's a thing that has to do with our existence here and humans in the DNA. It's the DNA. It's completely has to do with the sun and our DNA. They made this barrier. So when you think probes, spaceships, everything can go through it, but the people can't, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason for a lot of things they don't tell us. But yeah, I hope this kind of clears up a lot of the stuff, and this is only, one small part of it. And we can always go further into any of the subjects that you guys want to, but I kind of like doing these in little segments, and that way I can kind of keep your attention and this and that. And yeah, so hope everybody enjoyed the show, and may the force be with you.